In the middle of the 19th century, before automobiles, skyscrapers, interstate highways, and shopping malls, an ordinary citizen, Frederick Law Olmsted, had a vision for America's cities.
We want a ground to which people may easily go after their day's work is done, and where they may stroll for an hour, seeing, hearing, feeling nothing of the bustle and jar of the streets, where they shall, in effect, find the city put far away from them.
Throughout his career, Olmsted designed over 500 nourishing green spaces in all corners of the country.
Olmsted, he's one of the towering figures in the history of American cities, the history of American landscape.
He was the forefront of the anti-sprawl movement.
There would be no national parks without Olmsted, state parks without Olmsted's vision. I mean, he was there in the beginning.
The Olmsted legacy shaped this nation.
He was effectively creating palace grounds for common people.
The guy who works 6 days a week in the factory, brings his family here, stands on this hillside and says, "This is our estate."
In the middle of the 19th century, public parks did not exist in American cities. While wealthy citizens retreated to their country estates, poor city dwellers had no escape. New York City was unhealthy. Crammed into overcrowded tenements, people lived on top of each other in squalor. Sanitation and waste methods were primitive. The stench was intolerable. Disease widespread. The grid plan, established and carried out by the city fathers in 1811, which gave the island of Manhattan its leveled and democratizing numbered map, allotted almost no room for open green space. Visionaries in New York understood that the city would continue to grow rapidly and eventually run out of space.
New York City wasn't developed very much above 23rd Street. It was kind of teetering on being a great city, but not a great city. And the city leaders realized that what do we need in New York to make us compete with the great cities of the world? And two things that really popped out. One was you needed fresh drinking water, and then two is you needed a great park.
The man who would build this park, transforming the 19th century American city irrevocably, was Frederick Law Olmsted. Early one morning in 1831, 9-year-old Frederick Law Olmsted left his home in Hartford, Connecticut with his little brother John to visit his cousin's cottage in Cheshire, 16 miles away. The boys, unaccompanied, walked for 2 days through the rural Connecticut countryside. Olmsted was fearless and at home in the wilderness.
The happiest recollections of my early life are the walks and rides I had with my father in the woods and fields. Sometimes these were quite extended, and really tours in search of the picturesque. Thus, before I was 12 years old, I had been driven over the most charming roads of the Connecticut Valley, through the White Hills and along most of the New England coast, from the Kennebec to the Naugatuck.
Olmsted would later devote his life to bringing this natural joy to the masses of America. Born in Hartford, Connecticut in 1822, Olmsted at an early age was introduced to the hardships of a 19th century existence.
My mother died while I was so young that I have but a tradition of memory rather than the faintest recollection of her. I remember playing on the grass and looking up at her while she sat sewing under a tree.
Olmsted was 4, his brother John 1 when their mother died. His father, John Olmsted, a prosperous dry goods merchant, remarried shortly thereafter and had 4 more children.
The children of the first marriage were somehow a little bit left out. Olmsted was already, I think, 5 or 6 years old. There were these new children. All the attention was paid on them.
Olmsted and his brother John became close and adventurous friends. With their house as full as it was, Olmsted's father elected to send Olmsted away to receive his education at a series of boarding homes. Nature became the one constant that Olmsted could turn to throughout his tumultuous childhood, and he quickly developed a fierce independence.
He wasn't a natural student. He was the kind of person who learns more from experience and from looking at things than from books. This all adds up essentially to a kind of difficult childhood and to some extent, I think, a solitary childhood too.
When 14, I was laid up by an extremely virulent sumac poisoning. I was troubled for several years with a disorder of the eyes, and the oculists advised that I should be kept from study.
It was expected that Olmsted would continue his education at Yale, but in light of his condition, he turned instead to a young life of work and the outdoors.
Olmsted was both, I think, psychologically and mentally uninterested in higher education.
At the time my schoolmates were entering college, I was nominally the pupil of a topographical engineer, but really, for the most part, given over to a decently restrained vagabond life, generally pursued under the guise of an angler, a fowler, or a dabbler on the shallowest shores of the deep sea of natural sciences.
Got a job through his father in an importing house in New York City, did that for a year, went to sea as a merchant seaman for a year.
At the age of 21, Olmsted took a year-long formative trip to China as a deckhand on a merchant ship. Conditions on the ship were grisly. Olmsted nearly died of malnourishment and spent a mere 4 days off the ship in China. Here, he came to identify with the life of the common man. On December 10, 1843, he wrote his brother John from aboard the Ronaldson, bound for the East.
My dear brother, I suffered most severely from seasickness, but I never wished myself clear of the ship. Even in the time of greatest danger, when the captain expected the bark to go down in 5 minutes and that old topsail that we just got reefed down close was a cracking away. Oh, Jack, the old sea is glorious, sublime after all. Dear brother Jack, God bless you. I'm crying like a baby. Your loving brother, Fred, all the world over.
The man came from a range of background experiences that were very human, very approachable, and shaped his ability to think both at a grand scale and for the common man.
Back home in Connecticut, Olmsted felt pulled toward the land of his childhood.
Rural tastes at length led me to make myself a farmer. I had several years of training on widely separated farms, then bought a small farm for myself.
22-year-old Olmsted studied the art of the gentleman farmer and enrolled in Yale as a special student, studying science alongside his brother and friends. He began reading the agricultural journals of Andrew Jackson Downing, who would give landscape new meaning to Olmsted.
Andrew Jackson Downing was the leading landscape gardener and writer about landscape design in the 1840s.
He'd sort of raised public taste in the broadest sense, in gardens, in architecture, and interior decor.
Olmsted read Downing's journal, The Horticulturist, and actually began to contribute articles to that journal. So Olmsted was aware of Downing as a person who said that aesthetics, and especially the aesthetics of gardening and of landscape, were a crucial element of creating civilization.
Downing showed Olmsted that a new America could be made, one where cities and towns could be planned to include public parks, where greenery could uplift even the poorest citizens. It was at his Newburgh estate that Downing first introduced Olmsted to his architectural assistant, the young Englishman Calvert Vaux, who would soon play an invaluable role in Olmsted's career. With Downing's encouragement, Olmsted, at 28, took a walking tour of Europe with his brother John. They lived on pennies a day and saw for the first time the democratic urban parks of Europe, in particular Liverpool's Birkenhead Park.
Olmsted and his friends were amazed that the people of Birkenhead themselves had created this. It was not something that was given to them by a prince or a king.
Here was a park that was used by many people, working people as well as middle-class people, and they were all kind of mixed together.
This was the sort of institution that they thought the American Republic should be providing for itself.
In democratic America, there was nothing to be thought of as comparable with this people's garden.
He was also impressed with the overall coherence of the design, the way that the walks and the drives moved through the landscape, the way that different kinds of experiences were achieved in different parts of the park. And all of those were elements that were in his mind when he started to design Central Park a number of years later.
Shortly after his return, Olmsted chronicled this trip to Europe, publishing Walks and Talks of an American Farmer in England. It was the first of many successful published works. Ever more enticed by the promise of literary success, Olmsted sold his farm and, having established himself as a roving correspondent, went to tackle the southern United States.
As a journalist, he traveled throughout the United States on this long tour of the South, sending weekly reports to the New York Times, a brand new New York Times. So he got very good at going into a situation, as a journalist does, and sort of understanding it very quickly.
After traveling the plains of Texas and the bayous of Louisiana, under the pseudonym Yeoman, the former vagabond farmer found he had developed a literary reputation in New York. Word of his success quickly spread.
Olmsted had an important standing in what they call the literary republic of New York, the literary world. And also he'd served for a couple of years as the editor of Putnam's Monthly Magazine, a journal of opinion, of politics, of literature, and had published the writings, significant writings of a number of leading American writers, including first publication of articles and short stories, both by Melville and Thoreau.
It was due to his new esteem and also to chance that Olmsted was led to the job that would become the most important of his career. The city fathers had set aside land in the center of Manhattan for a new park so that rivaling neighborhoods from the east and west could appreciate it equally. The site for the park was a large plot of swampy, rocky land occupied mostly by squatters.
It was just at that time that the new commissioners were looking for a superintendent of the parks.
The obvious choice to bring New York's Central Park to life would have been Andrew Jackson Downing.
Downing also called for the creation of a great park in New York City worthy of that city and of the city that it was to become.
Tragedy struck, however, when a steamship accident took Downing's life in 1853.
It's one of those questions of history. What if he hadn't died? Would Olmsted have come up? You know, wouldn't Downing have just overshadowed him and gotten all the big jobs? Wouldn't they just have hired Downing to do Central Park? I suspect so. So would Olmsted ever have had the opportunity to blossom? Perhaps not.
Never the slightest thought, till I was more than 30 years old, had entered my mind of practicing landscape gardening, except as any fairly well-to-do working farmer may.
Olmsted spent a great deal of time in the London parks. He had seen the new parks of Paris under construction. He had seen parks in a number of the other cities throughout Europe, Italy and Germany in particular.
Olmsted believed in Downing's idea of a great park for New York City. Tapping into the knowledge he gained as a journalist and gentleman farmer, he began avidly lobbying to become the superintendent of Central Park.
There was a group of very influential people that Olmsted could turn to for signatures to support his candidacy for the superintendency of Central Park in the fall of 1857. In fact, it is said that the signature of Washington Irving was what got him that job. That, combined with the signatures of a number of other significant and important and influential people in New York City, was enough to get him a position of landscape and construction, not of literature.
After a very long session and much debate, I am elected. On the final vote, 8 of those present voting for me, 1 against me. The strongest objection to me? That I am a literary man, not active. Yet if I had not been a literary man so far, I certainly should not have stood a chance.
Olmsted was named superintendent of Central Park on September 11, 1857. He was 35 years old. 2 months into his new job, news came that his brother and dear friend, John, was fatally ill with tuberculosis. On November 17th, Olmsted received a final letter from his brother.
Dear, dear Fred, it appears we are not to see one another anymore. I have not many days, the doctor says. I never have known a better friendship than ours has been, and there can't be greater happiness than to think of that. Don't let Mary suffer while you are alive. God bless you. John.
John Hull Olmsted left behind his wife Mary and 3 children, John Charles, Charlotte, and Owen. A deep grief settled upon Olmsted. Again, he turned to nature to find solace, but this time his focus was on making it accessible to others.
Just at the time that Olmsted is becoming superintendent of Central Park, superintendent of a park that really at this point does not have a design. He's simply in charge of preparing the site and will then presumably be in charge of construction once the design is chosen.
As talk increased about who would design the park, A.J. Downing's former architectural partner Calvert Vaux campaigned to see his late partner's dream realized.
Egbert Ville, who was an engineer, had been hired to design the park, and Vaux looked at Ville's plan and decided it was a disgrace, and a disgrace to the memory of Downing. So Vaux undertook the political games necessary to have Ville's plan derailed. He arranged for there to be a public competition.
So he approaches Olmsted, who has just become the new superintendent, and says, look, you understand the park, you're there all the time, your local knowledge will be crucially important for the creation of a design. If the two of us join together, we can have a fine design and we have a good chance of success.
Olmsted says no. Olmsted says no because he doesn't want to step on his boss's toes. His boss is Egbert Ville, the engineer, but Vaux must have pushed and pushed and pushed Olmsted. So Vaux got Olmsted to approach Ville, and Ville, who was like, yeah, whatever, do whatever, who cares? And of course, they have the winning design.
When Central Park is built, is a very important moment, not just because it's a big park in New York City, but it's really the first big urban park in any American city. The closest comparison to Central Park was the American cemetery, so that in an odd way, it's the cemetery is the precursor to the public park. People would go to our picnics to cemeteries. Whether or not you had somebody close to you in the cemetery, they were beautiful green spaces.
Vaux and Olmsted developed their design over the winter of 1857. Olmsted working on the plan late into the night after dealing with his daily superintendent duties. Their design, which they called Greensward, was sinuous, with large expanses of open meadows and wide, winding paths.
A drive must so be prepared that those using it shall be called upon for the least possible exercise of judgment as to the course to be pursued, and that they shall be free from the disturbance of noise and jar.
They called for thick copses of trees to line the park's borders so that visitors would see on all sides not street traffic or stone buildings, but a seemingly unending woodland.
The traditions that he was drawing from talked about different kinds of landscapes. The most important was what was called the pastoral, or the beautiful. It was particularly to be found in the kinds of meadows that he designed in his parks. And his large parks always had one large open meadow, a space that seemed very extensive, one that seemed much larger than it really was. So that the pastoral landscape was to act as a specific antidote to the artificiality of the city.
Dame Nature is a gentle woman. Gradually and silently the charm comes over us. The beauty has entered our souls. We know not exactly when or how, but going away, we remember it with a tender, subdued, filial-like joy.
The other style was what was called the picturesque, one that offered variety to the pastoral. In his writings about the parks, he says, well, you got to have some variety. You can't just have a big meadow and let it go at that. You've got to have some change of experience, and the picturesque offers that. It had to do with roughness and ruggedness, shagginess, a contrast to the smoothness and flow of the pastoral.
Four transverse roads had to be included in each of the 33 design entries. Olmsted and Vaux, intent on isolating their pastoral park from the harsh intrusion of street traffic, sunk their roads in underground tunnels.
Nobody else came up with that solution. And it was that kind of willingness to do significant engineering and re-engineering of the site in order to make the park work that was a hallmark of Olmsted's design work thereafter.
It is of great importance as the first real park made in this country, a democratic development of the highest significance, and on the success of which, in my opinion, much of the progress of art and aesthetic culture in this country is dependent.
They had a vision, first of all, which far exceeded, I believe, their budget. But they went on to the $1.5 million budget. You had to have your plan. They just did what they did and set a cost by $1.5 million. But they were reorganizing the landscape. They were encouraging large meadows and very broad areas of lakes, the infinite sense that they wanted to have, as well as the intimate sense that they wanted in the woodlands. I describe Central Park as a beautiful and very simple tapestry.
The board deemed Olmsted architect-in-chief, bestowing on him the duty of overseeing the construction of his design, in addition to his taxing duties as superintendent. They also forced Olmsted and Vaux to incorporate, among other changes, 2 new carriage entrances, a 20-foot wide 3-mile bridle path, and 19 bridges that would allow this complex series of trails to flow gracefully without crossing. A year into construction, the cost of this work, which Olmsted was held fully responsible for, mounted to $265,000 more than the board had allocated. In today's money, this is over $6 million.
He had to deal with a controller, Andrew H. Green, a man who was very concerned about cost and cost effectiveness.
Andrew Haswell Green was a real penny pincher, and here is Olmsted and Vaux, who are, they want what they want. They're artists. They have a vision. It's going to cost more money.
Olmsted talks about the way he would have to go all the way downtown to convince Green to authorize 15 cents for some object or other. And it was extremely frustrating to him.
Remember that Olmsted was going against impossible odds of the corruption of the city, of the mismanagement in the city. He was troubled with patronage and had to hire people that weren't skilled. He was very demoralized and discouraged, quit a million times.
It was passion that Olmsted claimed sustained his taxing work on the park. Ever since a failed engagement to the daughter of a high-profile Connecticut lawyer in his early 20s, he gave up on love, substituting instead work.
There was no hope on earth that I would not have sacrificed to my desire to hold that position. I am capable of stronger passions than many men, and I never had a more desperate passion than that. A great deal of disappointed love and unsatisfied romance and downtrodden pride fastened itself to that passion.
Olmsted opted for a marriage of duty to his brother's widow, Mary Perkins Olmsted, in June 1859. They were married in Central Park. Olmsted and Vaux would ultimately devote 15 years to designing, constructing, and supervising Central Park. By the fall of 1859, over 17,000 trees and shrubs had been planted, and construction on the park had been finished up to 79th Street. At peak times, as many as 4,000 workers were employed, and Olmsted later estimated that nearly 5 million cubic yards of land had been moved.
Or nearly 10 millions of ordinary city one-horse cart loads, which, in single file, would make a procession 30,000 miles in length.
By the summer of 1860, Olmsted's energy was depleted, and his health failed by the day. When his horse spooked on a drive through Upper Manhattan with his wife and newborn son, Olmsted suffered a crippling broken leg. His recuperation, long and slow, was delayed further by the loss of his son from cholera just a week later.
He was troubled. He had a sad life. He understood and needed the calm and the quiet and the peacefulness. That's what made him feel good. And I think that's what he brought to his parks and his landscapes.
I really believe Olmsted's genius was the fact that he knew how to take the designs that they're creating on paper and make them come to life. And I think that's what was a real challenge. You know, not much of this was ever done before, and particularly in the United States, this was the first time that an urban park was being created in the middle of the city.
By the winter of 1859, the pond near the southern entrance to the park had frozen, and citizens on ice skates came in droves. The following summer, the board approved free Saturday afternoon concerts, which became hugely popular. Olmsted estimated that on many days, nearly 100,000 people visited the unfinished park.
The time will come when New York will be built up, and when the picturesquely varied rocky formations of the island will have been converted into foundations for rows of monotonous straight streets and piles of erect angular buildings. There will be no suggestion left of its present varied surface, with the single exception of the park.
150 years later, this is the most incredible democratic space that you can imagine. He wanted a place that all New Yorkers and visitors could come into, and when you came through those walls, we have all become one. That is the most important thing that he wanted, and there's absolutely no question that was created.
Opportunity would arise again for Olmsted, this time in the guise of war. While he stayed involved with Central Park remotely, the preservation of the Union was at stake, and Olmsted offered himself to the cause.
After Central Park, Olmsted really drifted away from landscape architecture. He wasn't a designer, he wasn't somebody like Vaux who saw his future in design. He thought he might be a publisher, he might be a civil servant, he got involved in the Civil War.
Of chief concern to Olmsted was providing public service that would improve the lives of American citizens. The same kind of civilization that he brought to the people of New York, he would impose upon the Union Army troops. He was appointed General Secretary to the United States Sanitary Commission, which was in charge of the health conditions of Union troops. It was the precursor to the Red Cross. The troops were ill-equipped, overworked, and demoralized. As conditions worsened, Olmsted wrote,
"There is but one sanitary measure to be thought of now, and that is discipline. The health, comfort, and efficiency of the Army are all united in their dependence on a strict, uniform, and all-pervading military discipline."
Olmsted at once employed the use of his notorious organizational skills, successfully creating a relief system on a national scale that included ships that would transport wounded soldiers along rivers rather than bumpy roads.
When he did work, he was very immoderate. He would throw himself into his work, he would get caught up in it emotionally, mentally.
George Templeton Strong, treasurer of the Sanitary Commission, ironically called his life habits insanitary, remarking,
"He works like a dog all day and sits up nearly all night. Doesn't go home to his family for 5 days and nights altogether. Works with steady, feverish intensity till 4 in the morning. Sleeps on a sofa in his clothes and breakfasts on strong coffee and pickles."
By 1863, Olmsted's relationship with Strong and the Sanitary Commission had grown tenuous. While his management skills were unparalleled, he often butted heads with his superiors. When the new owners of a large gold mine in Mariposa Valley, California, offered him the position of superintendent, he accepted. It paid handsomely, and he found comfort in being able to suitably provide for his new family.
I think going to California was very important in terms of his landscape architecture preparation, because he sees a totally different landscape. He sees a landscape of enormous scale, these great mountains around the valley, the wildness of it.
In August 1864, Olmsted was appointed to the Yosemite Commission, presenting a treatise on the importance of reserving the area for the public and petitioning for a carriage drive that connected the valley with the closest major road. This magnificent landscape, he believed, should be accessible to all of America.
When he gets back and starts working on Prospect Park, he brings to it a kind of scale which really comes from the American Western landscape.
Originally, Brooklyn, the great Brooklyn, was a separate city and very competitive with its city of New York across the water. So the city fathers of Brooklyn were headed up by a guy named Mr. Stranahan. And Stranahan had commissioned a design for a new park. He went to Calvert Vaux, who was still here in the city, and said, well, what would you do differently? And Vaux is actually the hero in this story, because he said, oh, you would never leave Flatbush Avenue in the middle of this park. That was a big mistake we made in Central Park. We had to have those transverse roads. And you should buy land over here, you should do this and this, and he sketched it out. So Stranahan was thrilled. And he said, wow, I would love to have you do this. And he said, I can't do it without Olmsted.
I think Vaux convinced Olmsted to leave California, to come back and join him and work on this. Olmsted kind of resisted this all the way.
Vaux wrote Olmsted repeatedly. Think this over, he said. We are neither of us old men, you know. To me it seems and always has seemed a magnificent opening, possible together, impossible to either alone. In the end, Vaux's promises that the two would be able to return to their work in Central Park lured Olmsted east.
And Olmsted loved Central Park. It involves a very large chunk of his life, and that was, I think, what tipped him.
There is no place in the world that is as much home to me. I love it all through, and all the more for the trials it has cost me.
What would have happened if Olmsted had said no to Calvert Vaux? I just think it would never have gotten off the ground in the same way. Cities were starting to look at building parks, and they did understand that you wanted parks because Central Park had made such a big difference. So there would have been people who would have risen up. But would they have been the same philosophers? Would they have understood why parks make such a difference to cities? Would it have taken on the same kinds of significance? I don't believe it would have.
The park space that Vaux proposed was almost perfectly sanctioned off from the busy streets of Brooklyn. It called for no transverse streets, like those that had constrained the meadows and woodlands of Central Park. The land of Prospect Park, unlike Central Park's rocky swamp, was easy to mold and perfect for what would become Olmsted and Vaux's classic park.
So Vaux and Olmsted make a design. The city fathers look at it. They say, we like it. They gave him the go-ahead. And then the city fathers went on vacation. It was the beginning of the summer. And they said, well, just start. You're on your, do it. And so they had terrific freedom. And you really see that in the park.
Thrilled by this new promise of freedom, Olmsted and Vaux began construction in July 1866. With that freedom, they created the Long Meadow, 90 acres of rolling pastoral landscape, a full mile in length, the largest open space in any urban park in the country.
Olmsted and Vaux viewed Prospect Park as a classic design, partly because of the extent of the Long Meadow itself and the achievement there of the pastoral landscape that Olmsted thought was crucially important for every park. Also because there was the variety that they thought a great park should have. And the flow from the pools down through the ravine to the lake is a classic example of the picturesque style.
To my mind, the Long Meadow Prospect Park is the single greatest surviving example of the Olmsted landscape, of those beautiful waving hills and hillocks with the copses of trees that sort of invade in from the sides, and it seems to go on forever. I think the genius of Olmsted and Vaux is most evident there.
There's aesthetic experience involved, but always underlying the aesthetics is something else, something more powerful, he thought, more important, and it's really, you define it much more as health than anything else.
What he stresses about parks is that you got away from the city to receive the psychological calm that you needed. That mental refreshment is what he called it, and that's what he was really searching for and assumed everybody else was searching for, which we are, particularly in cities.
And that therefore makes the park what Olmsted called the most valuable antidote to the artificiality of the city, and particularly counteractive of the stress caused by modern life.
Olmsted knew that his vision for the park would take decades to grow in. He would never see many of his works fully realized. But towards the end of his career, Olmsted did come back to visit Prospect Park, taking in the expanse of the Long Meadow lined with towering mature trees. He commented,
"I am prouder of it than of anything I have had to do with."
The fun thing to do is to give people a tour and actually describe to them that it's designed, because they totally do not believe it's a design space, because it feels so comfortable and so natural. And yet every tree is perfectly placed, is thought about, how you will feel walking through it, the different emotions you will have coming out from the dark to the light.
I think urban park systems are as important as urban road systems, urban transit systems. They're the basic building blocks of healthy cities, beautiful cities, attractive cities, cities people want to live in.
The enjoyment of scenery employs the mind without fatigue, and yet it exercises it, tranquilizes it, and yet enlivens it. And thus, through the influence of the mind over the body, gives the effect of refreshing rest and reinvigoration of the whole system.
The 1868 report to the Brooklyn Park Commissioners noted that in July alone, there had been over 100,000 visitors to the incomplete park. And as Stranahan had predicted, property values adjacent to Prospect Park had already increased. Olmsted and Vaux were suddenly in demand across the country. City leaders had seen the successes of Central and Prospect Parks, and they wanted urban parks of their own as fast as possible. Olmsted treated each new commission as an experiment, bringing new ideas in park building to life. In Buffalo, he and Vaux were asked to design not just one park, but a park system for the entire city.
Olmsted, throughout many projects, was trying to find ways that parks could reach into the city rather than making people go to the park, you could take the park through neighborhoods. And his parkways and boulevards, which sound just like big streets, but they're really green streets. They have trees down the center, trees on each side. They have places sometimes for horse riding in the middle.
He was so intrigued with this idea of parks to parks and how that actually builds a city, because as we all know, he was a fabulous city planner. And so that connecting of cities by pulling their neighborhoods together, building those neighborhoods through parks, was really amazing.
Olmsted traveled extensively for his work, with his family firmly rooted on the East Coast. Mary, since their marriage, had given birth 3 times. 2 sons were lost. A girl, Marion, survived. The birth of his son in 1870, christened Henry Perkins after Mary's father, was a milestone for Olmsted. Rejecting his Christian name, Olmsted referred to him for a time as Boy, before officially naming him after himself when the child was 4. John Charles, by this time, was already hard at work in his father's office.
It's 18 years between John Charles Olmsted and Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., but both of them were really being groomed by their father to take over the business.
As Olmsted's sons became more involved, his partnership with Vaux suffered. Vaux felt continually slighted by the recognition Olmsted received for the pair's work. Olmsted, meanwhile, disagreed with Vaux's conception of their profession. Vaux saw themselves as artists. To Olmsted, they were public servants, shaping the social nature of the cities they changed. The two parted ways in 1872. Olmsted accepted a commission from Boston, where he would come to work and eventually live until the last years of his working life.
It was a group of thoughtful, enlightened citizens who brought him here and said, design us a park system.
Concerned government leaders called on him to fix the city's unhealthy waterways, which were unsightly and rapidly spreading disease.
2 of the earliest parks were actually engineering projects as well as parkland. They were the Back Bay Fens and the Riverway Park. The Muddy River sanitary improvement was really designed to convey stormwater and sewage. And the Back Bay Fens was a tidal marsh that was fouled by years of raw sewage dumping into it.
It's called the filthiest marsh and muddy flats to be found anywhere in Massachusetts. So when Olmsted first comes up here in the 1870s, his job as he sees it is a very practical one, is to help regulate the water flowing into the Back Bay Fens, to stabilize the environment.
What are you likely to have there eventually? A big conduit of masonry to carry the flood? Such an arrangement will be costly and be delayed many years. Meanwhile, the Muddy River Valley will be very dirty, unhealthy, squalid. No one will want to live in the neighborhood of it. Why not make it an open channel there? Then the roads would be the beginning of a parkway leading from the Back Bay to the Arboretum and West Roxbury Park.
Most 19th century cities, if they had a water course running through it that became polluted, they would just put it underground and forget about it. Olmsted thought, though, that if you work with engineers, if you work with thoughtful design, you could actually keep these water courses open and then provide a nice green, verdant environment.
Most park users, when they use the park, don't see the engineering. That's the magic of Olmsted. He could design things that feel so right and are so natural that they never see the fabulous engineering that's lying underneath. I think that's a huge lesson for engineers today, that you can actually have an engineered flood control system that serves for the many, many days that it doesn't have to serve its flood control purpose as a wonderful park.
Eventually called the Emerald Necklace, the park system is a ribbon of green cutting through the city of Boston, connecting the centuries-old Boston Common with the sweeping expanse of Olmsted-designed Franklin Park.
Frankly, he gave the city of Boston its aesthetic shaping.
I really do think that the gift of Olmsted Parks to communities has meant that there is common ground, that there is something we all earn and own together, and that it is that fabric that makes your community vital, and it is the kind of thing that you lose at your peril and that you gain as a gift.
From Fairstead, his new home in Brookline, Massachusetts, the Olmsted firm, which then included stepson John Charles and would soon include his son Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., he embarked on some of his most recognized works. The United States Capitol needed grounds to complement the majestic building. Olmsted found a way of subordinating his landscape to the architecture. It was in Chicago, however, on the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival to America, that Olmsted was able to plan a city from scratch.
Chicago decided this would be the biggest and best fair ever. Daniel Burnham was one of the chief organizers. He brought in all these architects to design buildings, but the first thing he brought in was the best planner in the country, who was Frederick Law Olmsted. And Olmsted, the first thing he said is that the best thing about Chicago is your lake.
And so he said, the thing you want to display most clearly is Lake Michigan, and nothing else, unalloyed, so that you get the full, strong sense of the presence of the lake and the sublime power of the lake.
There is but one object of scenery near Chicago of special grandeur or sublimity, and that, the lake, can be made by artificial means no more grand or sublime.
There was a site which was a potential site, and they said the problem is it's all marshy, and there's the land is so low that it floods all the time. It's going to be very difficult to build there. And Olmsted said that, no, we'll create lagoons and we'll create canals, which is really a way of controlling the water, and we'll build up the land. And that's, in fact, the way the plan works. Nobody ever built a lagoon park before, but it was a way of handling the problem. That's where Olmsted always starts, not with some personal idea. He's always, how do you solve whatever this problem is that he's been given?
For the World's Columbian Exposition, Olmsted sought to cohesively combine the grand architectural statements of legendary architects Daniel Burnham and McKim, Mead, and White.
And the plan of what became known as the White City, the exposition, is another example of Olmsted's versatility as a planner, because one of the things about the classicists, McKim and Burnham and all these great architects, is that they had a very rigid idea of how the White City should be organized. And Olmsted's idea of the fair was much looser, was much more that you need a formal part, but you need a sort of circus as well. It's about people having fun. In order to accommodate that, he designed the Midway. And the Midway was like a big carnival place with rides and burlesque and clowns and wild music and beer gardens. And so his view of parks was not Victorian. As parks became more popular, as they became more used, he realized what goes on in a park, and his parks became much more places which were both contemplative and very active.
Olmsted ultimately reshaped not just individual cities, but the landscape of America. In his working lifetime, he was asked to carry out over 500 commissions across the country: urban parks, academic institutions, public buildings, and private estates. Eventually, the movement spread beyond him, and cities from Philadelphia to San Francisco began to subscribe to the idea that cities deserved green spaces. Soon, the entire country was being painted green. His goal remained to bring a sense of psychological well-being to others. His own health, meanwhile, deteriorated to a new low as he suffered from insomnia, chronic headaches, fatigue, and constant ringing in his ears. Doctors were unable to diagnose one specific ailment and therefore rarely offered any cure. Rather, they concluded he simply worked himself sick.
His life, in a sense, is this series of breakdowns, sometimes for months at a time. And they're probably a combination of depression, debilitation from working too hard, but also psychological depression, perhaps, because there's a time when he spends sort of 6 months in a darkened room. It's not clear what's wrong with him, but he just can't function.
As his health worsened, he focused on training his sons to take over the firm. John Charles had already been formally taken on as head draftsman and would become partner of the firm in 1884. Olmsted worked to make sure his younger son would follow the same path. While Frederick Jr. was at Harvard, Olmsted prescribed 5 extra hours of reading a week on landscape architecture.
I want you to be prepared to be a leader of the van. How much abler should I have been had I had your education? How much more had I had the education that you may have 10 years hence?
At Biltmore, the Vanderbilt mansion and Olmsted Sr.'s last project, it eventually became necessary for Frederick Jr. to take over for his father. Olmsted by then was suffering from a form of dementia, unable to communicate clearly with his staff. It was also at Biltmore that the revered American painter John Singer Sargent was working on a portrait of Olmsted to hang within the walls of the estate. Sargent had Frederick Jr. finish sitting for the portrait once his father retired at the age of 75 in 1897. Olmsted's last years were wrought with confusion and depression. Eventually, the family relented, and Olmsted was admitted to McLean Hospital in Waverly, Massachusetts. It was his second visit to McLean. His first had been in 1872 on a commission to design the hospital's grounds. This time, they disappointed him.
They didn't carry out my plan, confound them.
Olmsted died on August 28, 1903, at age 81. His son Frederick was by his side. A small funeral was held at Fairstead the next day, and he was buried unobtrusively and without pomp in the Olmsted family gravesite in Hartford, Connecticut.
Olmsted invents the profession of landscape architecture, and a lot of landscape architects, I have the feeling, really don't like Olmsted. It's a little bit like being a composer right after Mozart or Beethoven. This giant figure who doesn't just do great parks, he also sort of invents the whole profession.
After his father's death, Frederick dropped the junior from his name, and thus it is widely held that the work of Frederick Law Olmsted spans more than 100 years. The Olmsted firm continued to design landscapes in the drafting rooms of Fairstead until 1979. By then, the firm had completed 6,000 commissions with more than 700 public parks, parkways, and recreation areas.
The great thing about Olmsted and Vaux's designs are that they are flexible, beautiful, usable, they are forever. And the brilliance of the design is that even today, they are as usable and important to people as they were in the 1860s. They still do all the same things. They still replenish your soul.
Olmsted's legacy was to keep nature in cities. He let Boston and New York and Buffalo and 1,000 other places keep their rural roots intact even as their cities grew around them. And so for millions of people, nature's just a step away.
I think the Olmsted legacy is intrinsically democratic and intrinsically American.
In all my life, I have never seen such joyous collections of people. I have in fact more than once observed tears of gratitude in the eyes of poor women as they watched their children thus enjoying themselves. When the arrangements are complete, I see no reason why thousands should not come every day to use them. Who can measure the value, generation after generation, of such provisions for recreation to the overwrought, much confined people of the great town that is to be?